Hello, everyone, and welcome to Comcare's information session about understanding your 23-24 premium. My name's Michael Duke. I'm the Deputy CEO of Comcare and the General Manager of Comcare's Scheme Management Group, which is the group that is responsible for determining premiums. I'll be your host today. I'll firstly start with an acknowledgement to country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands of which we are all virtually meeting today. I'm joining you from Melbourne, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and acknowledge the contribution that they have made and continue to make. I'll also extend my respect to other Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander people who may be present today. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the cultures of everyone here today and the richness that these cultures bring to the work that we do. The Comcare community is a very diverse and eclectic community, and we welcome that. So I might kick off, and I just really want to thank everyone for taking the time to come along to today's information session. We really appreciate that there's a lot of interest in premiums and how they're calculated. It's definitely something that we have looked forward to resuming post-COVID disruption. Previously, we used to run in-person forums, and it's been a while since we've been able to coordinate and get something together for you all to hear about premiums and the scheme more broadly. This session is indeed a direct response to a lot of feedback that we received through Comcare's employer survey, who many of you have participated in. We also get general feedback that has reinforced the need for us to continue to engage with you all on premiums and claim management outcomes. That feedback has certainly shaped how this session has been prepared. I'd also like to acknowledge the people who are joining me today in presenting to you. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Ash Evans. Ash is a principal from Taylor Fry. Taylor Fry are Comcare's independent actuaries and really important as part of the premium process for us. We also have Chloe Eaton, who's the Acting General Manager of Comcare's Claim Management Group. Today, our session is really going to focus on a number of key areas. Firstly, we'll touch on the liability and the premium pool. This is really important. That premium pool and the liability is what Comcare is managing, and indeed Taylor Fry will do the presentation on that because Taylor Fry are in essence the independent actuaries who determine the pool of money that Comcare is required to collect to cover claims costs. I'll then talk you through some of the key steps in the premium process, as well as addressing the drivers of premium. Early intervention and return to work will be a common theme. Key observations and trends and initiatives in claims will be presented by Chloe. And finally, we'll be answering some of the questions that have been asked in the registration process, but also some of the frequently asked questions that we get around premium and claims management. Before I hand over to Ash, though, I might start with a bigger picture view of the scheme and help you contextualise premiums as a whole. Firstly, it's important to realise that a key driver of costs in our scheme is the payment for time off work. We call that incapacity payments. Comcare is one of the last long-tail schemes in the country. What this means is that incapacity payments can continue for decades after the injury. They can be continued up until the pension age, which is 67 at the moment. So if someone is quite young when they are injured, it's a possibility that they could be on incapacity benefits for quite a long time. Other payments, like medical treatment, for example, can continue for the lifetime of that individual. Again, in a long tail scheme, these costs accrue and amount over time. It's important that you're aware that injury prevention and return to work performance is critical to keeping scheme costs down. As I mentioned before, this will be a common theme woven through today's presentations. So our scheme as a whole, we need to be aware that claims for psychological disease are a large share of the claim portfolio and a key cost driver. Psychological claims continue to have poorer return to work outcomes than injury or disease claims. When we look at the mechanisms of psychological injury within our scheme, it's really clear that the two most predominant type relate to work-related harassment or workplace bullying and work pressure. These are the most prevalent psychological harms that occur in our scheme. Prevention strategies in both of these areas have proven to reduce claims and reduce costs. So it's really important that you think about those types of claims and how you can reduce them and minimise their impact. Another important thing to be aware of is just the scale of the scheme. Currently, there are about 1,900 employees or ex-employees of the Commonwealth in receipt of incapacity benefits. Last year alone, there were accepted incapacity weeks for the scheme, adding up to 1,650 people off work for the entire year. This is a large impact on the productivity in the APS. In fact, that number would be enough to fully staff a number of medium-sized APS agencies. So it's worth letting that sink in for a moment, because we're not just talking about financial costs. All of these claims come with an individual employee at the end of it. So there are individual employee impacts. There's an impact on their family, there's an impact on the broader community, and there's, as I've mentioned before, as you can see with the number, there's an impact on our national capacity and productivity. So that's probably enough of the bigger picture. I'd like now to hand over to Ash Evans, the principal at Taylor Fry, who's I mentioned before is Comcare's independent actuary. Ash is going to speak to you all about the liability and the premium pool. So I'd like to welcome Ash.
Thanks, Mick. Yeah, as Mick mentioned, I'm Ash. I'm a principal at Taylor Fry, and I'm Comcare's independent actuary. The actuary part of independent actuary is about the advice we provide. We advise on the premium and the liability. We'll be talking about that today. Financial sustainability. In fact, we advise on anything sort of long-term quantitative based that's asked of us. That's our job. We forecast long term, and Comcare is certainly, as Mick said, a long tail or a long term scheme. The independent part of independent actuary is that we call what we see strikes and balls, if you like, because we've got a responsibility to the claimant as well. In the instance of the outstanding claims liability, our responsibility is to the yesterday's claimants, the claimants that have for accidents that have already occurred, and for the premium, we have the responsibility to tomorrow's claimants, the accidents that will occur in the premium year in question. Our responsibility there is to ensure enough money is put aside or collected so Comcare can meet its obligations under the SRC Act. I will just quickly take control of this. So what I am going to do today is I'm going to quickly give a high-level view of premium history, a short premium history, discuss what that actually means. I'll be looking at some drivers of the premium and some particularly the recent drivers of the premium down over the last decade, as well as some of the headwinds that we're facing. And then time permitting, we'll look at liability there at the end as well. All these things matter and ought to matter to you as premium payers. So let's dive straight in to the premiums. Now, I am an actuary, so my slides will be populated by numbers. What's the premium pool? The premium pool is the total amount that we recommend be collected across the APS, across the whole premium scheme for a future accident year. It's intended to be the amount of money, it's the amount of money that we anticipate needs to be collected in order to cover claim payments, that being medical costs, incapacity benefits, impairment awards, legal costs, the administration of every claim that for an incident that occurs in the premium year in question, the upcoming one being 23-24, in order for those claims, in order for enough money to be collected so those claims can be managed through their whole claim journey, so through to retirement or through to death in the case of medical benefits. That's the objective of the premium pool. Each year we set this early in the year. It goes through some processes, and then that's collected from yourselves, the premium payer, in July, I understand. What's happened in the premium over the last 6 years is demonstrated in this chart. So up to and including 2018-19, the premium as a percent of wages sat in excess of 1%. Since that time, there has been gradual improvement in the performance of the scheme, and therefore reduction in the premium rates. And we can see that here in the chart. And since that time, it's sat pretty consistently around that 0.8 to 0.85 level. And now this chart hides a few things. For starters, we've actually had a downward trend in our advice. What we're showing here is the premium that was set. The premium that was set in some past years included a discount, and I think Mick will be talking about that later. Next year, the funding position is well balanced for Comcare, so there's no discount, but we can actually see there is that at 0.84, the premium that's being set is actually, for the APS overall, is actually very consistent with recent years. On the right-hand side, mainly out of interest, mainly because I like to compare things, we show the premium rate for other schemes across Australia. Here we show South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and New Zealand being the most comparable schemes, although it's worth saying that Comcare is a fairly unique scheme in the type of benefits that it offers, and also in the employees, the type of employees that it covers. But what you can see here in comparison to the other schemes is that Comcare as a percentage of wages does have a relatively low premium for a workers' compensation scheme overall. That's the high level, very high level view of premium. I'll zoom in a slight amount more and look at what drives the premium. Because this is really how we react each time. This is why the premium moves each time. And while there are some sophisticated models behind the scenes, it can really be reduced into a few key dimensions. When we set a premium, we care about three things. How many claims are there? How long will they be on benefits when they do claim? And how much are they getting paid, particularly for incapacity benefits? So how many, how long, and how much? These are really the three dimensions or the three levers that are there to influence the liability and the premium. We start first here with how many claims, or what we would call a claim frequency, because this is a real good news story, and this is what's led to that reduction in premium that we've seen over the last 5-6 years. Particularly if we look on the left-hand side of this chart, what we've got here is the number of injury and physical disease claims accepted each year for the last 8 years. And you can see a real remarkable trend here. And that what we're seeing here is that the number of claims accepted over this period we're almost at a third of what we were 8 years ago. It really is quite a remarkable result. And goes some way testifying to the benefits of injury prevention, occupational health and safety, and potentially some scheme utilization in there as well. But far fewer claims coming in means that premiums are lower and liabilities are lower as a result. While how many claims overall is a good news story, it is worth looking at the right-hand chart as well here, where we look at psychological disease claims accepted. The trend is not quite so clear here. We did have a very high couple of years of psychological disease claims in 2013, 14, and 14, 15, the latter of which we show here on the chart. From that point, it sat in the low 200s for a few years. The last few years, it has been creeping up again. That has put some offset some of the improvement from injury and physical disease, and has put some upward pressure on the premium and the liability as well. And you can see that slight trend upwards there. Now, if you're looking at just the headline numbers here, there are far fewer psychological disease claims than there are injury and physical disease claims, although they are, with the decrease in injury and physical disease claims, they are making up a larger minority than they did previously. However, the number of claims they might be the minority of claims in number, but the majority of claims in terms of cost. The average psychological disease claims we estimate to be 4 to 5 times more costly than the average injury and physical disease claim. And one way of thinking of that is one psychological disease claims is equivalent to 4 to 5 injury and physical disease claims in this chart. So it actually doesn't take a lot of movement, particularly in the psychological disease claim cohort, to really impact your premium and the liability that Comcare see. But overall, how many claims is a good news story of the last 10 years? And we wait with bated breath to see where this goes from here. So that's how many claims. As I mentioned, there's two other dimensions that are levers in the scheme, how long and how much. I'll quickly, on the left-hand side of this next chart in terms of headwinds, talk about how long, that's claim duration. And the best way of thinking about that is in terms of return to work, because that's what we mean by how long and claim duration. And this is the single most important component of the liability and the premium. It's really, return to work rates are really influential. Those who follow the news will understand that if you follow the news on other schemes and what's happening in workers' compensation in some of the East Coast schemes, where the financial sustainability of schemes is in question because, in large part, because return to work rates have deteriorated significantly. In some instances, employers are staring down the barrel of substantial increases in premiums and substantial rewriting of legislation because of, in large part, deterioration in return to work. So it's something we pay a lot of attention to. While all return to work is important, in assumption setting and as a driver of the premium and the liability, how long-term claimants return to work is extra important. And the reason for that is we think of a long-term claimant, for instance, as someone who's been on benefits more than 5 years. Their return to work rate potentially influences the next 20 years, the next 30 years of incapacity benefits, because in Comcare, under the SRC Act, individuals can remain on incapacity benefits all the way up until age 67. The chart I show here is a reciprocal, if you like, of return to work, and this is net leavers. So these are the individuals who have been on benefits for more than 5 years, who have more than 5 years since injury, the number of people who are leaving benefits each year. And what we can see here is that it's fallen down a little bit. So over the 4 years to 2018, we were seeing somewhere between 100 to 200 individuals return to work, or at least leave benefits each year. It's worth noting that that was a high point. Prior to that point, it was lower, but that hasn't been kept up. So we are seeing fewer individuals who are long-term claimants go move off benefits or go back to work over the last 4 years. You can see that very clearly on this chart. We're now under 100 for the last 4 years. There can be many drivers of this particular feature. One is there are actually fewer claims to return to work because so many return to work during those earlier 4 years. So that's all taken into account in the premium, and that's why we haven't seen premium increases commensurate with this change. But also it's just very difficult to get individuals back to work once they've been on benefits a long time. But the benefit in terms of premium and liability of getting long-term claimants back to work is outsized. I've mentioned how many claims and how long. I don't have a graph for how much, which is quite unusual for me, but it's worth mentioning just briefly. You might think that how much is not a lever, in that how much someone gets paid per week or per fortnight is really a function of their job prior to being injured and their role in government. Not quite. It's more you can influence it more than that, in that how much is also influenced by partial return to work. If someone's able to find, if there are suitable duties and someone's able to partially return to work, that influences our assumption setting around how much an individual would get paid while they're on incapacity benefits. So that is influential as well. The last item there, which is not a driver that I mentioned on the right-hand side, is economic conditions. This is something none of us have control over, or if you do, I'd like to know a few things, but it's something that we're all vulnerable to. Anyone with a mortgage will attest to that. The premium is no different. We're collecting premium now to pay for claimants over the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Our forecast of inflation matters for that, and our forecast for investment return matters a lot for that. As inflation and investment returns change, so do the premium. The premium, we advise, is vulnerable to this volatility, and sometimes the movement you will see in premium year to year is simply the outside economic environment impacting what needs to be collected in order for enough to be collected to meet the Comcare to meet the obligation to those claimants. I think I've taken up my allocated time. Our last item I'll do very quickly. So that's the premium. The same things that drive the premium drive the liability. On this slide, I have the outstanding claims liability. It is currently, for the premium scheme, $1.7 billion. This is the amount of money Comcare have put aside in order to meet the obligations of everyone who's been injured up to the 30th of June 2023. With 75% probability, but we needn't go into that. Why does it matter how much this number is? Well, if the number goes down, Comcare's funding ratio improves, and the premium tends to be discounted when the funding ratio improves. And what sends this number down? Primarily return to work rates. So I'm harping on return to work rates a bit. It is the largest driver of these results. And it is, in some sense, the most the biggest lever as well. It's the bit that can be influenced most in the claims portfolio. I am well out of time. I apologize for running over. I will leave our view of the premium and liability there, and I'll hand back to Mick.
Thanks for that, Ash. Appreciate it. And can just start to see some of the comments coming in. Look, if we don't get to your comment or question, certainly we intend to produce some documents, some FAQs and those sorts of things where we'll look to get answers post this session as well. Okay, so again, thanks, Ash. I'd like to now talk to you a little bit about the steps that Comcare takes in the premium process and focus on addressing the drivers of premium. So Comcare measures premium paid as a percentage of your entity's payroll. The good news is that despite some of the pressures that Ash had talked about, in particular some of that economic volatility, the 23-24 average premiums are only up very marginally from last year. Last year we're at 0.83% of payroll. This year we're at 0.84% of payroll. Despite that, all premium payers will be affected by this marginal change. The main driver behind the increase in this overall change is in fact the removal of the 10% premium discount that was applied last year. So in last year's premium, we applied a 10% premium discount across the pool. This year, we're not in a position to be able to provide that. And I'll come to that in a little bit later. At a pool level, though, this was mostly offset by higher estimated interest rates. So the interest return that we got actually offset the ability of us to be able to grant that 10% discount. Ash touched in his slides where Comcare sits in the jurisdiction, but it is worth noting indeed that in a recent Safe Work Australia comparative report, Comcare recorded the lowest premium across the jurisdictions in Australia, but also recorded a reduction in premium charged by 27% over the past 5 years. It's important to call out that that's not down to Comcare, that's down to agencies. That's down to employers focusing in and around the prevention of injury, but also the engagement with return to work and early interventions to really get people back to health and back to work. So what does the 23-24 premium cover? So the long-term nature of claims means that the premium forecast, which is done through the pool, has to include estimates of future inflation and benefits and investment returns. And again, it's important to remember this is the lifetime cost of claims that we expect to occur in 23-24. So the calculated premium is set to fully fund the forecast lifetime costs of claims arising out of injuries and diseases that will be sustained in the 23-24 financial year. And it also includes the amount that we need to capture in order to manage those claims for the lifetime of those claims. So what kind of things are covered in those costs? So the types of things that are covered, as I mentioned before, is time off work. So benefit payments, salary payments, top-ups for partial return to work, medical and rehabilitation expenses, lump sums for death or permanent impairment, and legal service costs. The lifetime costs of the 23-24 injuries and diseases will continue to grow and continue to emerge in their profile for the decades to come. It's also worth mentioning here that there are many schemes across the world that have come unstuck due to insufficient funding. And Ash talked a little bit about the East Coast of Australia before. What we're really seeing is pressure in relation to the ability for schemes to fund their liabilities on an ongoing basis. Comcare takes that responsibility really seriously, and we do guard our funding ratio now and ensure that we have a fully funded scheme. The importance of that fully funded scheme really means that we aren't then in a position where we are required to add levies to the premium that is paid. So being fully funded is really important from a premium payer's perspective because it enables us to just issue the premiums as we see them and not apply levies. Key elements of the premium calculation, many of you probably are aware of this, but it's important to touch on it. The premium calculation uses accepted claims with a date of injury, and that's quite important, in the last 4 financial years. So for this year's premium, it will be 2018-19 to 2021-22. This is what we call the premium window. Now, within the premium window, we look at the lifetime costs of these claims divided by an entity's payroll. And the lifetime costs are calculated as the payments already made plus the estimated future payments. So how do we estimate those future payments? Well, we have a statistical case estimate system, and it calculates an estimate for each claim that reflects the characteristics of that claim. So it includes thinking about things like the type of injury and the emerging pattern of benefits that is paid on that claim, including the time off work or whether it's returned to work, and including the type of medical treatment, etc., that might be occurring on that claim. Our statistical case estimate model was developed in conjunction with our actuaries, so in conjunction with Taylor Fry, and was most recently updated in 2021. I'm pleased to say that our new case estimate system outperforms our previous system when it's been evaluated against historical claims. So we do cross-reference it against outcomes on claims. The new estimates also uses more up-to-date data than our previous system. So we're quite confident in its ability to estimate claim costs accurately. And we're constantly reviewing and refining it to ensure its accuracy. What makes up the premium calculation? Comcare calculates the premium for your entity as a sum of 2 components. The prescribed amount is your entity's share of the premium pool for that financial year. So it's the slice of the pie that we are allocating to you based on your claims experience. It is calculated by multiplying your entity's prescribed rate by your entity's estimated payroll for that financial year. The prescribed rate that I mentioned is determined by the prior year's prescribed rate by the pool trend, by the performance adjustment. I'll come a little bit to each of those elements in a minute. There's also a bonus and penalty component, which is an adjustment to your contribution to the previous year's premium pool. This is based on an extra year of claims data and updated claims performance. So that's why it's always important to maintain a focus on what is happening with those claims, because those changes can impact the bonus and penalty. If I turn to the pool trend factor, it's important now that we consider the trends in the claim experience across the overall insured scheme. This is the advantage of a pooled insurance experience. So the pool trend factor is really the sum of the whole and what is happening in the scheme overall. That's the importance, that's the value of being in a pooled insurance scheme. If the final premium pool, as a percentage of the insured scheme payroll, has decreased since the prior year, then our pool trend will be less than 100%. What that means is that will tend to decrease your entity's premium. Conversely, if the premium pool has increased, the pool trend will be greater than 100%, and this will tend to increase your entity's premium. The pool trend factor reflects changes in the scheme's claim performance since the previous year as a percentage of payroll, and it's based on the forecast that Ash has spoken about already. Importantly, the same factor applies to all insured entities. So it's the one pool trend for all entities. On the screen, you'll see the results from the pool trend from last year, which reflect what I talked about before, where there's a slight increase in the overall average premium. I'll touch now a little bit on the performance adjustment element of the prescribed amount. The performance adjustment calculation is what gives weight and also what responds to your entity's claims experience. Our model balances the need for premiums to respond to changes in performance with the need to provide some stability and minimise, where possible, unnecessary volatility from year to year. Now, that can be difficult because from year to year, claims experience can vary widely in some entities. The performance adjustment reflects the changes in your entity's incurred cost rate relative to the overall scheme from last year. Now, the incurred cost rate is the estimated lifetime cost of claims divided by payroll, which is what I talked about before. It's used to measure performance in respect of reported and accepted claims only. So it doesn't some schemes take into consideration risk profile of industry and those sorts of things. In Comcare, we focus it in and around the claims. The reassessment window is the injuries in the last completed 4 years, so that premium window, and the lifetime costs is using that statistical case estimate to estimate the likely future costs. So what are the common drivers of an entity's performance adjustments? So I've just outlined a couple of them here on the slide for you. So the first and most obvious is the premium window moves forward at 1 year. So each year we move forward 1 year, which means a different 4 years are calculated as part of that. So what we have is an older year dropping off and a newer year dropping on. It's extremely unlikely that those 2 years will match in terms of costs. So if it was a high cost year that dropped off and a lower cost year that came on, you might expect that your premium would be lower. Conversely, if it was a low cost year that dropped off compared to a high cost year that came on, you can expect probably an increase. Other impacts might be changes in the existing claims within the premium window. So what we have is that in 1 year, we might set the premium and we might have some expectations around what's happening on that claim. But what could happen is a claim that was basically only medical and had no time off work might then start to have some incapacity on it. So we need to make adjustments for those kinds of experiences that might occur. Other things that can happen are processing delays. So what we do see from time to time is particularly in some high cost claims, employees can submit claims for several years of incapacity of back pay or reimbursement of old medical costs. So when Comcare was setting a premium previously, we may not have had visibility of that, and then it lands within that premium window and we have to make adjustments accordingly. It's also not uncommon for claims to be accepted late. So claims for older injuries in the premium window can be accepted late for a number of reasons. The person may not have lodged the claim because they weren't ready to lodge the claim. Equally, the claim may have been going through just through a disputation process. So we may have initially denied liability, and the employee may have exercised their right for reconsideration and ultimately gone through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal or even the federal court. If those decisions get turned around, then ultimately we may be up for paying years of incapacity costs on that claim. I'll touch now on the bonus and penalty. The bonus and penalty is really a calculation that uses the same method as the performance adjustment value. Each entity's share of the prior year premium pool is adjusted by changes in your entity's incurred cost rate relative to the overall scheme since the last year. The difference between the revised and initial prior year prescribed rate is multiplied by your prior year's estimated payroll to determine the bonus and penalty. The purpose of the bonus and penalty, apart from being something that we need to consider as part of our legislative responsibility, is that it also achieves a fairer allocation of the prior year's premium pool between entities by reflecting changes in their claim circumstances, as well as late receipt of claims. We do have some information on our website available to all of these things, and we'll circulate that as part of this, part of what goes out after this session. So how can you affect your entity's premium? Most injured employees have less than 1 week off work, but the few who remain on incapacity benefits for longer than a year account for the majority of the claim costs within the scheme. If you're looking to reduce future premium rates, you really must work towards reducing the number of claims by preventing workplace injury and supporting employees to stay at work. And there's been some great outcomes in the scheme over the last 5 years in that space. You can also reduce costs of claims, and payments for time off work make the largest part of that. So obviously returning people to health and work is the best way to reduce those costs. I really do hope that this has provided you with at least some insight into what we're doing. The premium process is quite technical and has a number of components to it, both from the actuarial perspective, but also what Comcare does. As I mentioned before, this is the start of a journey for us. We're keen to continue engaging with you on premium and premium methodology, and we'll continue to do that over the years to come. I think it's important now for me to hand over to Chloe, as Chloe will give you an update on sort of trends in the claims management experience, and I'll hand over to Chloe now.
Thanks very much, Mick, and good morning, everybody. I'm Chloe Eaton, the Acting General Manager of the Claims Management Group at Comcare. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we're meeting today and any Indigenous Australians who are with us today as well. I'm joining you today from Canberra, from Ngunnawal country. So as Mick and Ash have highlighted, the two main drivers of premium are the number of accepted claims and the costs of those claims. So today I'll talk to you about the trends in the type of claims we're receiving and what this means for prevention, early intervention and return to work efforts. Also, I'll talk to you about the drivers of those costs, current return to work rates and challenge areas, steps you can take to address these, and how Comcare can help, and some of the initiatives we're taking to help improve outcomes on psychological claims in particular. So in terms of claim frequency, this slide shows on the left-hand side that from 1819 to 2021, both the overall number of claims received and the number of each claim type has decreased, although the drop in psychological claims has been less significant than that for injury or disease claims, as Mick and Ash talked about earlier. So this means that psychological claims are now a greater proportion of total claims received, rising from 29.7% in 1819 to 35.5% of total claims in 21-22. So this could mean that the strategies that you've all introduced as employers for prevention and early intervention have had a stronger impact in reducing physical claims than psychological claims. And you can see the graph on the right-hand side of the slide shows that claim acceptance rates have remained very steady overall, but with an increase in acceptance of psychological claims. And psychological claims are now not only a greater proportion of new claims than before, but also a greater proportion of total open claims. Now, over 50% of our total open claims relate to primary psychological conditions. And you can really see the impact of this when it comes to average claim costs. The importance of preventing psychological injury and providing effective early intervention support is highlighted further when we look at average lifetime claim costs. And this is important because the cost of accepted claims on hand flows through to the premium pool and ultimately your premiums as employers within the scheme. This slide shows very starkly how much greater the average total liability cost per psychological claim is. Ash talked about this earlier. At about $300,000 per claim, the average lifetime cost of a psychological claim is roughly 4 to 5 times the cost of other claim types, which average a bit over $60,000 and $75,000 respectively for injury and disease. So in the first year alone, psychological injury claims on average result in almost double the cost of injury and disease claims. However, as psychological claims are typically more complex, more time off work, greater incapacity costs, which are the greatest driver of claim costs, this gap continues to expand over the life of the claim. We can also see this reflected in return to work performance, which is directly linked to incapacity costs. So, excuse me. Here you can see that while return to work in the premium scheme is tracking well for injury and disease claims at over 85%, psychological claims are a major challenge at only 51.6%. So this is also seen in the median incapacity durations. Currently, this is 12.8 weeks for all injury types and more than double that for psychological claims at 27.7 weeks. In good news, we have seen an improvement in the last 12 months. But return to work for psychological claims remains the greatest challenge in the scheme. And for the scheme to see improvement financially, we need to see an improvement in return to work rates, particularly for psychological claims. And look, we've touched on this throughout the presentation today, but return to work performance is critical for multiple reasons. It's obviously critical to the recovery of injured employees. We know that good work is good for people. And so returning to work can have a really positive impact on recovery, which flows through to claim costs, etc. And it's critical to maximising the productivity in your agencies, as Mick referred to earlier, 1,650 people off a year, and critical to also minimising the costs of claims to your agencies. Long-term absence increases claims costs such as incapacity payments and treatment and increases claim duration. We know from research that the longer a person is off work, the less likely they are to get back to work. And that's particularly the case for psychological claims, which are typically more complex, tend to have longer recovery, resulting in more time off work, and can be more challenging to get back to work. So that's why it's important for our scheme to have a focus firstly on preventing psychological injury, and then on that really effective early intervention, including to support recovery at work where that's possible, and return to work for those with psychological injuries. And improving return to work rates for psychological claims will directly impact scheme performance. To help us focus prevention, early intervention and return to work efforts so they more effectively manage the risk of psychological injury, it's important to understand the primary causes of psychological injury. So this slide shows the top 6 mechanisms of injury for psychological claims. The data used for this slide is for accepted claims for premium paying agencies in the last 2 years, so fairly recent data. And you can see from the slide that this work-related harassment and workplace bullying is the most common cause of psychological injury, followed by work pressure. This really highlights the importance of fostering positive work culture and good work design. And this slide also includes the return to work rate for each of these types of mechanisms of injury, which is around 55%, with the exception of exposure to a traumatic event and exposure to workplace or occupational violence, which is even more challenging, with even lower return to work rates, around 30 to 38%. So both of these rates are well below the scheme return to work rate target range of 85 to 95%. In terms of return to work performance for your agency, it's really important to understand the claims contributing to your return to work rate and look for opportunities on those individual claims to improve return to work performance. So how do we improve return to work for psychological injury? And look, firstly, I really want to acknowledge that preventing and managing psychological injury is really complex and can be very challenging. Achieving return to work takes a really collaborative effort between all involved, the employee, yourselves as employers, Comcare, treaters, and others. And that in itself, managing all of those stakeholders can be really, really complex. So for any injury, but particularly psychological injury, the single most important thing that you can do is to establish a really strong, supportive relationship with the employee to help them in their recovery and help them get back to work as soon as it's safe to do so. That's because good work can promote further recovery from injury and illness, and recovery is critical to achieving a full return to work. And look, contrary to common belief, employees with psychological conditions don't have to be 100% well to be back at work. And that's really important to think about what people can do, working with their treaters to identify capacity for what they can do, or reasonable adjustments that can be made to facilitate a return to work as early as it's safe to do so. Employers have a critical role in supporting that recovery and return to work. And evidence shows there are proven strategies that will improve return to work outcomes. So firstly, early action is critical. Early and regular contact, responding positively, as well as access to early intervention programs that offer avenues to treatment and workplace supports. The relationship with the person's manager is particularly important. Sometimes that's broken down, and so in the absence of that, the relationship with the HR area is really important. Also reducing the concern associated with lodging a claim and avoiding unnecessary delays to claim lodgement. So sometimes we know that the average time between injury and claim lodgement for psychological claims is much longer than for other types of claims. And it's really important to make people feel that if that's appropriate for their condition, that they lodge that claim early so that we can start to work together on addressing those recovery issues and return to work issues. And alongside that, also that help with identifying suitable duties. Really important, as I said earlier, to think about what people can do. They don't have to be 100% well. What's their capacity, and what kind of duties would we give them? That might be in a different role for some people. And engaging with WRPs with the right skills and experience, particularly experience in managing psychological injuries. And there are some WRPs who specialise in that. So for those complex psychological claims, good to find them and engage with them. So in summary, preventing injury, particularly psychological injury, and providing effective early intervention and return to work support when they do occur will help improve return to work rates and have a positive impact on reducing premiums. So how can Comcare help? At Comcare, our aim is to work really closely and collaboratively with you to support positive outcomes on individual claim matters, and also to help you understand your agency's workers' compensation performance more strategically, the drivers, the risks, and to help you build capability to address them. And our account managers play a really important role in this. They'll support employers through the claim process, provide analysis and subject matter expertise in claims management strategies and practices, and can help employers identify where further support could help improve claim outcomes or uplift capability. Over the last 3 years or so, Comcare has really sharpened its focus on adopting evidence-based better practice approaches to how we manage psychological claims and support employers to manage them. We've done a number of things, and one of the things that we've done is to embed injury managers within claim teams. These are people with allied health qualifications, and including some who have psychological qualifications, and they work alongside claims managers, providing clinical expertise day to day about assessment, diagnosis, treatment, prognosis, and return to work strategies, really trying to make sure that we're using an evidence-based approach in the treatment that those employees receive. We've also introduced a psychological claim practice lead, and that's a dedicated role focused on assisting with the management of complex psychological claims and implementing evidence-based better practice approaches to how we manage psychological claims. And we've also increased the psychology and psychiatry resources on our clinical panel to better align with that increasing proportion of psychological claims. And we'll be trialling different ways of using this expertise at earlier stages of the claim to help ensure we get that correct diagnosis as early as we can and ensure that people are receiving evidence-based treatment and care approaches as early as possible. We've also established a dedicated return to work support team who works closely with claims teams, account managers and agencies, providing expert guidance on complex return to work cases, and also helping employers identify improvement opportunities, connecting them with resources and support to help build their RCM capability and return to work capability and improve that overall rehab and return to work performance. One of the really exciting things that's happened over the last year is that this team ran a really successful return to work pilot that offered alternate approaches to rehab and return to work for employees that had not been able to return to work using the traditional rehab approach. And employees who participated in the pilot were placed with a career coach and were offered job readiness coaching and an employment brokerage service to help find employment within or outside of the APS. And this scheme had a really good uptake. So out of 126 invitations, we had 40 employees register for the program, and of those 34 completed the program, which we're really pleased about. And of those 34, 14 achieved an employment outcome, which meant a return to work rate of 40%, which was much higher than the 20% expected for the same profile of claims who didn't undergo this program. Participants also reported improvements in experiences of psychological distress, financial distress, and general health. And of the participants, 85% had a psychological injury, and their average time since injury was 4.1 years. So due to these really successful results, I'm very pleased to say that we're now offering this program as a BAU service, and we're really hopeful that it will continue to see more positive outcomes in the future and have a downward impact on the cost of claims. We're always looking at what else we can do to improve the health and return to work outcomes on claims, particularly complex psychological claims. And currently we're developing some trials based on research evidence to better support employees with those complex psychological claims. One of those is focused on enhancing the level of service provided for new psych claims, and the other is focused on supporting employees with chronic psychological illness who've had a claim for a longer period of time to better help them navigate the claims process and coordinate care and treatment. And we'll keep you posted about these as they progress. So in addition to all of that, Comcare also has a range of resources to support employers. And they're on the slide there for you. I'd particularly draw your attention to resources addressing work-related harassment and bullying and work demands or pressure, given these are the most prevalent mechanisms of injury in the scheme. We'll also post links to these resources in the chat. And these resources are really accessible, include some really great bite-sized videos as well as written resources, and really suitable for that just-in-time piece when people need some information. So have a look at those after the session, and I'll now hand back to Mick for questions.
Thanks for that, Chloe. And we are drawing to very fine to the end of time, so we may not get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. So Chloe, one that just came up in the chat was around I think it relates to the return to work employment brokerage or the pilot piece there. Can you just give some information about how Comcare has decided who's part of that program?
Yeah, look, sure. We do have a look at the profile of claims, but the referrals are mainly coming through by claims managers and employers identifying people who might be suitable for that program. So if you think that you've got an employee who has been sort of long-term on incapacity and might benefit from that support, then please talk to the claims manager or ask your RCMs to talk to the claims managers, and they can look at referring that through. So yeah, that's the main way that we're identifying. But we're focusing on those older claims and those who have not been successful, that have had other return to work attempts with those traditional rehab approaches and have not been successful. So that's the cohort we're targeting.
Thanks, Chloe. Look, there were a couple of themes that came through. One of those was some of the research that goes in around return to work, particularly on psychological claims. I mean, that return to work brokerage and pilot was very much part of a research program. We also have some information around new access on our website, was very much founded in a research basis. Equally, we have a research monthly product that we produce, and you can subscribe to that through our website. And again, we'll circulate some of that information post this session. Also, some themes around data and indeed getting some visibility of some longitudinal data there. We do have some data published on our website, but based on what I'm seeing, you probably are looking for something a little bit longer there, so we can certainly explore that. Ash, there was a bit of a question which I might throw to you about, which was around the impacts of COVID. Now, I know you and I have had multiple conversations about COVID, and Ash, maybe perhaps you could just give some of your insight into Comcare's experience around COVID.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. And it's a good and pertinent question. The truth is, Comcare was less affected than a lot of workers' compensation schemes. There is likely some effects going on under the surface, but it netted out to not the impact that we were concerned about when COVID first hit. When it first hit, we were concerned that we would see a fall in return to work, but patterns seem to remain reasonably stable. We were concerned that working from home would bring a new type of hazard that would lead to more claims. It's not to say that it didn't, but I think potentially that we didn't anticipate in advance, but it seemed to displace other claims as well. In some instances, for instance, workplace harassment and bullying claims. So overall, COVID did not have a outsized impact. There were short-term issues, but no outside impact, and certainly not an impact that in the grand scheme of the premium or the liability we expect to be lasting.
Thanks, Ash. A couple other comments that came through around treatment and treatment impacts. James has had a go at sort of outlining some of the responses to that. But equally, that's probably a topic that we can probably look to bring forward at a future session in relation to this group and probably communicate a little bit about some of those things. Louise, I could see, put a really good question around whether we've done any sort of analysis on the potential impacts of the changes to the work health safety regulations and psychosocial. The reality is that we're probably alert but not alarmed in that space. We're certainly attuned to the fact that might drive perhaps a greater awareness of psychological harm within a workplace, but also just the topic more broadly. The fact is that those responsibilities have existed for quite some time. We have a reasonably stable profile in and around the site claim. We don't anticipate it to have a big impact, but we're certainly watching it, and it's part of a watching brief and forms part of ongoing conversations that we have with our actuaries. Look, as I said, we're not going to get a chance to get to all the questions and comments. I probably will just briefly touch on one thing because I mentioned it earlier in the presentation, and that was really about the pool discount. It's a really important question because it's been on the minds of a number of people. So a 10% discount was applied in 2022-23 to premiums because the scheme funding ratio allowed us to. So the scheme funding ratio is our assets over liability. It's what all workers' compensation schemes are guarding against at the moment. Basically where we landed last year was that we were above our target level. So our target level is about 125%. If we land above that in terms of our funding ratio, then we look to grant a discount across the pool. This year, though, we've landed below that. We're not underfunded, but certainly the economic conditions, as well as the fact that we granted a 10% discount, certainly shaved an amount off our assets, and that meant that we've sort of landed in, I guess, our Goldilocks zone in terms of funding ratio, where we're not too high, but we're also not too low. We've still got some buffer to combat against any economic volatility. So this year's funding ratio, as I said, decreased. Basically, we didn't apply the discount. That has an impact across the pool. But that approach does, as I mentioned before, ensures that we remain fully funded, and it protects us against things like volatile economic conditions, but also any changes in claim profiles. So it only takes, Ash's sort of slideshow before, it only takes a small movement in changes to, or a deterioration, for example, in net leavers or return to work outcomes, to have a really big impact on the premium and liability because of that long-term nature of it. So even changes of less than 1% can add millions to the premium and liability. So that's why we guard that funding ratio, and that's why that 10% wasn't applied. So look, in summary, I just want to highlight that we note there's been some good chat and some good questions, and we'll get back to you on those, as well as a number of resources, including the slides and a copy of the video for you all. I mentioned that it's the start of a journey for us. We want to continue the engagement around this topic, and we're keen to have your feedback on that. We will collate and review the questions. If you've got specific questions, though, around your agency and your premium, I do encourage you to engage with your account managers. They are there to help you. They can assist in providing any tailored information about premium, but equally some of the topics that we talked about, like treatment and those return to work initiatives as well. So feel free to reach out to your account managers. So thank you so much for coming along and being part of the session. We really do appreciate it. I also do encourage you to, I mentioned before about the research monthly that we produce. You can also subscribe to our e-news and follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. That's a good way to just keep up to date on what's happening across the scheme. It will keep you notified as we develop and release any of the latest research, any of the latest resources, as well as upcoming events and engagement. I really do want to thank you all for coming along today. It's been a really, hopefully, a worthwhile session for you all, and I wish you all the best. Stay safe, and we hope to speak to you all soon. Thank you, everyone.